The Visible and the Invisible by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Quotes. The Visible and the Invisible by Maurice Merleau-Ponty is a profound philosophical exploration of the relationships between perception, existence, and meaning. As Merleau-Ponty's final work, it represents a deepening of his lifelong inquiry into phenomenology, building on his earlier examinations of how the body and perception shape our experience of the world. This unfinished manuscript tackles the inherent tensions between the visible world, which is perceived by our senses, and the invisible structures that underlie and inform that perception. Central to the text is the concept of the flesh, a unifying notion that dissolves the traditional distinctions between subject and object, showing how both the perceiver and the perceived are intertwined. Merleau-Ponty's reflections on being, language, and the chiasm between the visible and invisible create a space for new understandings of ontology, suggesting that our experience of reality is deeply layered and cannot be fully grasped through rational or objective means. This work represents a significant contribution to existential philosophy, revealing the complexity and ambiguity inherent in human existence and knowledge. Quote 1. We see the things themselves. The world is what we see. This quote highlights the fundamental relationship between perception and reality. The immediate experience of the world seems transparent and obvious, but when we try to analyze or define it, complexities arise. Perception, though simple in experience, becomes a paradox when one tries to intellectualize it, just as St. Augustine described time as something familiar yet impossible to explain. This reflection underscores the deep connection between seeing and understanding, and the challenges in fully comprehending the nature of perception. Quote 2. The fact that the philosopher claims to speak in the very name of the naive evidence of the world does not excuse him. On the contrary, he dispossesses humanity only the more completely, inviting it to think of itself as an enigma. Merleau-Ponty critiques philosophy's tendency to claim clarity on reality, only to deepen the confusion about the world and our place in it. The philosopher, by drawing out the implicit complexities in perception, often alienates humanity from the immediate and intuitive grasp of reality. Rather than providing answers, philosophy raises more questions, leading people to view themselves as mysterious beings caught between perception and knowledge. Quote 3. It is at the same time true that the world is what we see, and that, nonetheless, we must learn to see it. This statement reflects a central paradox in phenomenology. While perception of the world seems immediate and natural, true understanding requires effort and learning. Seeing is not a passive act, but one that involves deeper engagement and awareness. The world is familiar, yet we must continuously refine our vision to grasp its full significance. Quote 4. For after all, sure as it is that I see my table, as soon as I attend to it, this conviction is just as strongly contested by the very fact that this vision is mine. This quote reflects the inherent tension between the certainty of perception and the subjective nature of that experience. Even though we are confident in what we see, the personal and individual nature of perception raises questions about the reliability of this certainty. It brings attention to the divide between objective reality and subjective perception, challenging the idea that what we see is an unmediated truth. Quote 5. The world is what I perceive, but as soon as we examine and express its absolute proximity, it also becomes, inexplicably, irremediable distance. Merleau-Ponty captures the contradiction between the intimacy of perception and the inescapable distance it creates. Although we are immersed in the world through perception, attempting to express or understand this relationship introduces a sense of separation. Perception, once closely examined, reveals the gap between us and the world, making what was once near seem distant and elusive. Quote 6. It is the same world that contains our bodies and our minds, provided that we understand by world not only the sum of things, but also the locus of their compossibility. This quote reflects Merleau-Ponty's vision of the world as a shared, intersubjective space that integrates both physical and mental dimensions. The world is not just a collection of objects, but a place where our perceptions and experiences converge. The connection between body and mind within the world provides the framework for how we interact with and understand both ourselves and others. Quote 7. Our experience of the true, when it is not immediately reducible to that of the thing we see, is at first not distinct from the tensions that arise between the others and ourselves, and from their resolution. Merleau-Ponty suggests that truth is not something purely objective, detached from human relationships. Instead, it emerges from interactions and tensions between individuals. Truth is initially a lived emotional experience, shaped by encounters with others rather than being an abstract, detached concept. This perspective emphasizes the interpersonal and embodied dimensions of knowledge and understanding. Quote 8. And it is this unjustifiable certitude of a sensible world common to us that is the seat of truth within us. This quote emphasizes that the foundation of truth lies in our shared, undeniable sense of a common world. Despite the complexity and uncertainties of perception, this mutual certainty in a shared world provides the bedrock for truth. Merleau-Ponty points out that our understanding of reality, even if obscure and difficult to articulate, rests on this fundamental perceptual experience shared among humans. Quote 9. Because perception gives us faith in a world, in a system of natural facts rigorously bound together and continuous, we have believed that this system could incorporate all things into itself, even the perception that has initiated us into it. Perception provides us with a sense of faith in the continuity and coherence of the world. We believe that everything, including our own perceptions, fits into a unified system of natural facts. However, this assumption may be flawed, as perception itself is a dynamic lived experience that cannot be easily subsumed into such a closed system. This reflection opens up the idea that perception is more complex than simply fitting into a pre-established framework of natural laws. Quote 10. Philosophy is not science, because science believes it can soar over its object and holds the correlation of knowledge with being as established, whereas philosophy is the set of questions wherein he who questions is himself implicated by the question. Unlike science, which assumes an objective stance, philosophy is a field where the one asking questions is deeply involved in the inquiry itself. The philosopher is not detached from the subject of their exploration, but must grapple with their own place in the world they are trying to understand. This highlights the reflective, subjective nature of philosophical investigation compared to the objective, observational methods of science. Quote 11. It is our experience, prior to every opinion, of inhabiting the world by our body, of inhabiting the truth by our whole selves, without there being need to choose, nor even to distinguish between the assurance of seeing and the assurance of seeing the true, because, in principle, they are one and the same thing, faith, therefore, and not knowledge. Before we form opinions or judgments, we are already immersed in the world through our bodily experience. This kind of primal faith allows us to trust in what we see without having to consciously distinguish between seeing and seeing the truth. This immediate experience of being in the world is not about knowledge in a scientific sense, but a deep, embodied trust that merges our perception with reality. Quote 12. The philosopher must understand how it is that these two possibilities, which the perceptual faith keeps side by side within itself, do not nullify one another. Here, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes the philosopher's task of reconciling the coexistence of perception and its potential illusions. Perceptual faith holds both the belief in what we see and the possibility of its falseness, and the philosopher must understand how these two opposing elements do not cancel each other out. This challenge is at the heart of phenomenology, which seeks to explore the structures of perception without simplifying or dismissing its inherent complexity. Quote 13. When perception is full or effective, It is the thought of perceiving. If therefore it reaches the thing itself, it is necessary to say, without this being a contradiction, that it is entirely our work, and our own through and through, like all our thoughts. Merleau-Ponty suggests that when perception fully grasps the world, it becomes a thought in itself, a conscious awareness of perceiving. This implies that perception is an active, creative process entirely constructed by us. Even when it feels as though we are directly perceiving reality, this experience is a product of our own mental and bodily engagement with the world, making perception an inseparable part of our subjective experience. Quote 14. We have to situate that relation back within a more muted relationship with the world, within an initiation into the world upon which it rests, and which is always already accomplished when the reflective return intervenes. This quote refers to the need to understand perception not as a purely reflective act, but as something deeply rooted in a pre-reflective lived experience. The relationship between perception and the world is always already established before we begin to reflect on it. This underscores the idea that perception is not something we consciously initiate, but something that naturally unfolds as we are immersed in the world. Quote 15. If therefore the reflection is not to presume upon what it finds and condemn itself to putting into the things what it will then pretend to find in them, it must suspend the faith in the world only so as to see it, only so as to read in it, the route it has followed in becoming a world for us. Merleau-Ponty argues that reflection must be careful not to impose preconceived ideas onto the world. Instead, reflection should aim to suspend our assumptions about the world in order to truly see it. This allows us to trace the process through which the world comes into being for us, revealing the underlying structures of perception. In this way, reflection becomes a tool for discovering rather than shaping reality. Quote 16. Philosophy believed it could overcome the contradictions of the perceptual faith by suspending it in order to disclose the motives that support it. Philosophy tries to resolve the contradictions inherent in how we perceive the world by suspending or stepping back from that immediate perception to analyze its underlying reasons. This method, while seemingly necessary, ultimately transforms our natural faith in perception into something it was not, reducing it to mere belief backed by reasons rather than the fundamental, unquestioned way we live in the world. This reveals the tension between how we live in the world and how philosophy attempts to explain that living. Quote 17. It is because first, I believe in the world and in the things that I believe in the order and the connection of my thoughts. Our belief in the coherence of our thoughts and knowledge is founded on a more fundamental belief in the world itself. We trust in the world before we trust in any logical or conceptual order. This quote highlights how our primary engagement with the world is not through reflection or reasoning, but through a direct, unmediated faith in its reality. Quote 18. The only way to ensure my access to the things themselves would be to purify my notion of subjectivity completely. There is not even any subjectivity or ego. To truly access the world as it is, we must strip away all philosophical constructs of subjectivity and ego. Merleau-Ponty argues that to be in genuine contact with the world, we need to remove any sense of a separate self or ego that stands apart from the world. Only by viewing consciousness as a nothing, open and receptive to the world, can we avoid the interference of mental representations and images that distort our perception. Quote 19. If the negative is recognized for what it is, there is no longer a choice to be made between the unreflected and the reflection, between the perceptual faith and the immanence of my thoughts to myself who thinks. It is the same thing to be nothing and to inhabit the world. Merleau-Ponty argues that when we fully grasp the nature of negativity, the absence or nothingness within us, there is no longer a need to distinguish between unreflective, lived experience and reflective thought. To be nothing is to be fully immersed in the world, and this immersion is both our perceptual faith and the foundation of our reflective thoughts. The separation between thought and world dissolves when we recognize our fundamental openness and nothingness. Quote 20. There is no positive experience of another, but there is an experience of my total being as compromised in the visible part of myself. Merleau-Ponty suggests that while we cannot directly experience another person's being, we do experience the feeling of being exposed or seen by others, particularly through our visible external self. This feeling of vulnerability, or being viewed by others, shapes our understanding of ourselves as part of a shared world. The gaze of others brings a form of awareness, not of the other, but of how we exist in the world as beings who can be seen. Quote 21. What I am only at a distance, yonder, in this body, this personage, these thoughts, which I push before myself, and which are only my least remote distances. This quote emphasizes the idea that our sense of self is not something directly present, but always deferred, existing in the world at a distance through our body and thoughts. Our identity is something we project into the world, never fully grasped, always slightly out of reach. The self is something externalized, made visible and tangible through our actions, body, and the world we inhabit. Quote 22. Each one inhabits only his own, sees only according to his own point of view, enters into being only through his situation. Merleau-Ponty asserts that each person inhabits their own unique world, shaped by their particular situation and perspective. While we all share the same world, we experience it individually from our own vantage point. Our understanding of the world is thus deeply personal, rooted in our specific circumstances, and cannot be fully identical to anyone else's experience. Quote 23. The famous ontological problem, the "why is there something rather than nothing?" disappears along with the alternative. There is not something rather than nothing. The nothing could not take the place of something or of being. Merleau-Ponty resolves the classical philosophical question of why there is something rather than nothing by suggesting that the distinction between being and nothingness is illusory. Being and nothingness are not mutually exclusive, but intimately connected. Nothingness is not an alternative to being, but is always intertwined with it, making the question itself meaningless. Both coexist and define each other. Quote 24. If the other is really the other, that is, a for itself in the strong sense that I am for myself, he must never be so before my eyes. It is necessary that this other for itself never fall under my look. It is necessary that there be no perception of another. It is necessary that the other be my negation or my destruction. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes the impossibility of fully perceiving another person's subjectivity in the same way that we perceive objects in the world. If the other is truly an autonomous subject, we cannot reduce their existence to what we see. Instead, they remain beyond our vision, representing a force that challenges or negates our isolated self-experience. The alterity of the other thus lies in their invisibility and their power to disrupt our sense of being. Quote 25. It is necessary, and it suffices that the other's body which I see, and his word which I hear, which are given to me as immediately present in my field, do present to me in their own fashion what I will never be present to, what will always be invisible to me. This quote highlights that while we can perceive another person's body and hear their words, the subjective experience that underlies their actions will always remain hidden from us. The body and speech serve as indicators of an inner life that is forever inaccessible to direct perception. This introduces a perpetual distance between self and other, where what we perceive is only a representation of a deeper, invisible reality. Quote 26. The dialectic is the thought of the being seen, of a being that is not simple positivity, the in itself, and not the being posed by a thought, but self-manifestation, disclosure, in the process of forming itself. In this passage, Merleau-Ponty describes dialectical thought as a dynamic process of being that is not static or simply given, Being reveals itself through interaction and manifestation, constantly unfolding rather than being fixed. This understanding of being as self-disclosure suggests that the process of coming into being is ongoing and interwoven with our experiences and perceptions. Quote 27. Far from opening upon the blinding light of pure being or of the object, our life has, in the astronomical sense of the word, an atmosphere. It is constantly enshrouded by those mists we call the sensible world, or history. Merleau-Ponty reflects on how human existence is never a direct encounter with pure, unmediated reality, but is always filtered through the atmosphere of perception, history, and experience. This mist shapes how we engage with the world, and our understanding of reality is always enmeshed in layers of context and interpretation. Life is lived within this veil, where the boundaries of perception and historical experience color our interaction with the world. Quote 28. The philosophy of negativity is indissolubly logic and experience. In it, the dialectic of being and nothingness is only a preparation for experience, and in return, experience, such as it has described it, is sustained and elaborated by the pure entity of being, the pure negentity of nothingness. This quote speaks to the relationship between philosophy and experience, where negativity becomes a method of inquiry that integrates logical thought with lived experience. The interplay of being and nothingness prepares the ground for understanding reality, and experience both builds upon and refines this dialectical movement. The philosophy of negativity, then, is not merely abstract thought, but a process deeply tied to the concrete unfolding of experience. Quote 29. The effective, present, ultimate, and primary being, the thing itself, are in principle apprehended in transparency through their perspectives, offer themselves therefore only to someone who wishes not to have them but to see them. This passage explains how objects and beings are perceived not as static entities, but through the perspectives that reveal them. They are not possessed or fully grasped, but instead, they present themselves to a perceiver who is willing to engage with their presence without the desire to dominate or reduce them. This openness to seeing allows for a deeper encounter with being, one that respects the complexity and richness of the world. Quote 30. Our point of departure shall not be being is, nothingness is not, nor even there is only being, but there is being, there is a world, there is something. Merleau-Ponty suggests that the foundation of philosophical inquiry should not be based on abstract dichotomies like being versus nothingness, but on the fundamental reality that there is something. The focus is on the undeniable existence of the world and our presence within it, rather than trying to define it through rigid categories. This starting point allows for a more grounded and nuanced exploration of existence. Quote 31. The questions are within our life, within our history. They are born there, they die there, if they have found a response. More often than not, they are transformed there. Merleau-Ponty reflects on how philosophical questions do not exist in isolation, but emerge from the lived experience of individuals within their historical and social contexts. These questions evolve over time, shaped by experience, and often leading to more questions rather than definitive answers. Philosophy, then, becomes a dynamic process where inquiry continuously shifts and grows alongside human life, rather than a static search for fixed truths. Quote 32. The question would arise again, and indeed would be inexhaustible, almost insane, if we wished to situate our levels, measure our standards in their turn, if we were to ask, but where is the world itself, and why am I myself? This quote suggests the depth and complexity of existential questioning. If we examine the very foundations of our existence, such as the nature of the world and the self, we are confronted with questions that seem endless and overwhelming. The search for understanding transcends surface-level inquiry, pushing us toward deeper, often unanswerable reflections about our place in the universe and the nature of reality. Quote 33. Philosophy is the perceptual faith, questioning itself about itself. Merleau-Ponty encapsulates philosophy as an act of self-reflection, where the basic trust we place in our perceptions is called into question. Rather than accepting perception at face value, philosophy interrogates the assumptions underlying how we perceive and understand the world. This questioning process does not aim for easy answers, but instead seeks to explore the deeper layers of human experience and perception. Quote 34. When philosophy ceases to be doubt, in order to make itself disclosure, explicitation, the field it opens to itself is indeed made up of significations, or of essences, since it has detached itself from the facts and the beings. But these significations or essences do not suffice to themselves. Merleau-Ponty points out that while philosophy seeks to disclose deeper meanings and essences, these alone are not enough to capture the full reality of being. The process of philosophical inquiry involves more than just identifying abstract essences. It also requires engaging with the lived experiences that give rise to these meanings. Essence, though important, is always tied to the tangible, embodied existence from which it emerges. Quote 35. The visible can thus fill me and occupy me only because I who see it do not see it from the depths of nothingness, but from the midst of itself. I, the seer, am also visible. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes the interconnection between the perceiver and the perceived. We do not observe the world from an external detached standpoint, but are immersed within it. The act of seeing is part of the world we see, and our own visibility is part of the fabric of reality. This interconnectedness challenges the idea of objective detachment, placing the perceiver within the same realm as the objects of perception. Quote 36. Ideas that are too much possessed are no longer ideas. I no longer think anything when I speak of them, as if it were essential to the essence that it be for tomorrow, as if it were only a tacking thread in the fabric of the words. This passage suggests that ideas lose their vitality when they are held too rigidly. True ideas are dynamic and forward-looking, always pointing toward future possibilities rather than being fixed in the present. When we overpossess ideas, they become stale, losing their generative power. This forward momentum of ideas keeps them alive and relevant, constantly evolving within the flow of thought and discourse. Quote 37. Language lives only from silence. Everything we cast to the others has germinated in this great mute land which we never leave. Merleau-Ponty reflects on the deep relationship between language and silence, suggesting that meaningful speech arises from the unspoken, from the depths of silence that surround and ground our words. Without silence, language would lose its richness and connection to lived experience. Silence, then, is not an absence, but a fertile space from which language emerges, and through which it gains its power to convey meaning. Quote 38. The lived experience is not flat, without depth, without dimension. It is not an opaque stratum with which we would have to merge. The appeal to the originating goes in several directions. The originating breaks up, and philosophy must accompany this breakup, this non-coincidence, this differentiation. In this quote, Merleau-Ponty challenges the idea of lived experience as a simple, one-dimensional phenomenon. Instead, he suggests that lived experience is layered and complex, with multiple directions and breaks. Philosophy, rather than seeking to reduce this complexity, must engage with it, embracing the differentiation and contradictions that arise from the rich texture of life and experience. Quote 39. The visible about us seems to rest in itself. It is as though our vision were formed in the heart of the visible, or as though there were between it and us an intimacy as close as between the sea and the strand. This quote conveys the deep interconnectedness between the perceiver and the visible world. Merleau-Ponty describes a sense of immersion in the visible, suggesting that vision is not simply a distant observation, but something born from the very fabric of what is seen. The intimacy between the seer and the seen is like the relationship between the sea and the shore, where one continuously influences the other, making vision an inseparable part of the visible world rather than an external action. Quote 40. We must first understand that this red under my eyes is not, as is always said, a quell, a pellicle of being without thickness, a message at the same time indecipherable and evident. Merleau-Ponty challenges the notion that color, such as the red we perceive, is merely a superficial quality. He suggests that color is not just a flat, isolated attribute, but is deeply intertwined with its context, requiring engagement and focus to be fully perceived. This red exists in relation to other colors and objects, forming part of a larger network of meaning rather than a standalone quality. It evokes the idea that perception is always embedded within a broader context. Quote 41. The look, we said, envelops, palpates, espouses the visible things, as though it were in a relation of pre-established harmony with them, as though it knew them before knowing them. Merleau-Ponty speaks to the tactile nature of vision, as if sight involves a kind of intimate contact with the world. Vision seems to envelop the visible, interacting with it in a way that feels preordained, as if the act of seeing were always meant to discover what is already deeply known. This conveys the idea that vision is not a detached, objective process, but an embodied and familiar interaction with the world, where the visible and the seer are in harmony. Quote 42. We must habituate ourselves to think that every visible is cut out in the tangible, every tactile being in some manner promised to visibility, and that there is encroachment, infringement, not only between the touched and the touching, but also between the tangible and the visible. Merleau-Ponty reveals the deep connection between the senses of touch and sight. He suggests that the visible world is always linked to the tactile, that there is an interpenetration of the senses, where seeing and touching overlap and inform each other. This quote challenges the idea of a strict division between the senses, arguing instead that the visible and tangible are intertwined, each containing aspects of the other. Quote 43. He who sees cannot possess the visible unless he is possessed by it, unless he is of it. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes the mutual relationship between the seer and the seen. One cannot fully grasp the visible world unless one is also part of it. The act of seeing requires a kind of surrender, where the seer becomes enmeshed in the visible, making vision not just an act of observation, but an immersive experience where the observer and the observed are inextricably linked. Quote 44. The body unites us directly with the things through its own ontogenesis, by welding to one another the two outlines of which it is made, its two laps, the sensible mass it is, and the mass of the sensible, wherein it is born by segregation, and upon which, as seer, it remains open. Merleau-Ponty discusses the body as a mediator between the self and the world. The body is both a tangible, physical entity and a part of the larger sensible world. It is through the body that we experience and engage with the world, connecting our individual perception with the broader reality of the visible. This dual nature of the body, as both a thing among things and a perceiver, allows us to exist within and understand the world around us. Quote 45. To speak of leaves or of layers is still to flatten and to juxtapose, under the reflective gaze, what coexists in the living and upright body. This quote critiques the simplification of the body into separate layers or aspects, arguing that such distinctions fail to capture the complexity of lived experience. The body is not a series of juxtaposed elements, but a unified, dynamic whole that cannot be fully understood through dissection or compartmentalization. The lived body, in its entirety, transcends the reflective gaze that seeks to divide it into parts. Quote 46. There is vision, touch, when a certain visible, a certain tangible, turns back upon the whole of the visible, the whole of the tangible, of which it is a part. Merleau-Ponty describes the cyclical nature of perception, where the act of seeing or touching a part of the world reflects back on the whole. The visible and the tangible are not isolated phenomena, but are always connected to a larger context. Each act of perception engages with the totality of the visible and tangible world, making the individual perception part of a broader, interconnected experience. Quote 47. Our first truth, which prejudges nothing and cannot be contested, will be that there is presence, that something is there, and that someone is there. Merleau-Ponty establishes the undeniable fact of existence, the presence of something and someone. This quote emphasizes the most basic, irrefutable aspect of experience, the encounter with the world as something that simply is. It suggests that before any philosophical analysis or reflection, we are already in contact with the world and other beings. The fact of presence is foundational, a starting point for any further exploration of being or perception. Quote 48. The thing, therefore, is a node of properties such that each is given if one is. It is a principle of identity. Merleau-Ponty describes the nature of a thing as a collection of interrelated properties that together form its identity. This view emphasizes the interconnectedness of a thing's attributes, suggesting that its existence is contingent upon the presence of all these properties working together. The idea of the thing as a principle of identity suggests that its being is not simply a random collection of traits, but a cohesive unity that defines its essence. Quote 49. The thing thus defined is not the thing of our experience. It is the image we obtain of it by projecting it into a universe where experience would not settle on anything, where the spectator would abandon the spectacle. In this quote, Merleau-Ponty argues that the thing, as it is often conceived in philosophical terms, is an abstraction, a projection rather than something directly experienced. This thing is not the same as what we encounter in everyday life. It is an intellectual construct formed by imagining an experience devoid of engagement. The spectator, in this abstraction, is detached, and the thing loses its lived reality, becoming a mere image or concept. Quote 50. We do not even know in advance what our interrogation itself and our method will be. Here, Merleau-Ponty underscores the openness and uncertainty of philosophical inquiry. He rejects the idea of having predetermined methods or answers, emphasizing that true exploration requires a willingness to engage with the unknown. The process of questioning is itself fluid and evolving, shaped by the very experiences it seeks to understand, rather than being guided by rigid frameworks or expectations. Quote 51. It is not because the world called objective has such or such properties that we will be authorized to consider them established for the life world. Merleau-Ponty questions the assumption that the objective properties of the world, as studied by science, should automatically be taken as the foundation for understanding our lived experience. The properties of the objective world are not necessarily applicable to the life world, the world as we experience it. He suggests that our personal and perceptual engagement with the world is distinct from the objective descriptions provided by science, and the two should not be conflated. Quote 52. We are interrogating our experience precisely in order to know how it opens us to what is not ourselves. This quote highlights the philosophical goal of exploring how our experience connects us with the external world and with others. By questioning our experience, we seek to understand how we transcend our subjective selves and relate to something beyond, whether it be the world or other people. This process is central to Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological investigation, which aims to bridge the gap between the self and the external. In The Visible and the Invisible, Maurice Merleau-Ponty leaves his readers with an intricate vision of reality that challenges conventional dichotomies between the seen and unseen, the body and mind, the individual and the world. Through the concept of the flesh, he offers a framework that captures the fluid, interwoven nature of experience, where visible phenomena are always undergirded by an invisible dimension that cannot be fully articulated. The text remains a meditation on how perception functions as a dynamic process that ties us to the world, revealing that existence is not something to be categorized, but rather something to be experienced in its fullness. By rejecting objective idealism and exploring the chiasm between perception and reality, Merleau-Ponty encourages us to embrace the paradoxes and uncertainties of existence, showing that true understanding lies in the interplay between the known and the unknown, the visible and the invisible.
Curious to dive into the mind of Maurice Merleau-Ponty? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of the visible and the invisible in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.